Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and today we're gonna get the lead out. Okay, so for you Led Zeppelin fans out there, thanks for bearing with me for 2 videos. I had a couple of things I needed to get off my chest. And today's video is going to be part 3 and the conclusion to my introduction series on Led Zeppelin. Don't worry, there's more videos coming on Led Zeppelin, and we're gonna get into more in-depth discussions concerning this amazing band. But if you've noticed in these last 2 videos preceding this, I've stayed away from naming names. I mentioned 2 other musicians that John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page worked with. I mentioned a manager, and I also mentioned an engineer. And the reason that I've eschewed from other names outside the band proper is to truly focus on the amazing band, the rock band, the Led Zeppelin experience, as it were. But like in my Beatle videos, and more of them to come by the way, we'll be getting into the druthers concerning Led Zeppelin later on. Like I've said, my second favorite band of all time, and depending in what mood I'm in, my favorite band of all time. Now in my first video, I introduced some facts about the band, but basically it was a video ranking the 8 studio albums that Led Zeppelin put out. In the future, I also want to rank their live albums. And of course, we'll cover Coda down the line as well. In my second video, we focused on the 4 members of Led Zeppelin, and we're going to expand on that a bit in today's video as well. But the primary focus in today's video is the musical approach this band took. You know, with Led Zeppelin being released in 1969, there were few contenders to challenge this band, but there were a couple. First of all, there was Deep Purple. They were already a band, but they were still a psychedelic band, more akin to the early Pink Floyd than the sound that Led Zeppelin had. And of course, the same year that Led Zeppelin came out, Black Sabbath arrived. But are they true contemporaries of Led Zeppelin? Not really. You see, Led Zeppelin had been together since 1968. Their basic sound was already developed at the point of their first album. So there's an album and a band we can compare Led Zeppelin to. And we're gonna go ahead and compare Deep Purple, because the following year, 1970, Ritchie Blackmore and Company presented an album that sounded a whole lot like a Led Zeppelin album in certain places. All 3 bands with amazing guitarists. First, let's talk about Tony Iommi. I would rate Tony Iommi in my top 20 guitarists of all time. You go, only the top 20, Michael? Well, first of all, rock and roll has been around a while now, and there have been so many amazing guitarists that have arrived on the scene up until this day. If you've reached the top 20, you are a guitar rock god. This man lost the tips of his fingers, and the fact that he can even play guitar is amazing. First of all, you see, he made artificial plastic fingertips so that he could play guitar. And you know, somehow it's part of his sound, and that makes him a genre establisher as far as I'm concerned. And what can you say about Ritchie Blackmore? Ritchie Blackmore is probably my 5th favorite guitarist of all time. Number 1, of course, Jimmy Page. Number 2, depending on what album and what he's focusing on, of course, Eric the freaking Clapton, who just seems to get better as he ages. Number 3, of course, Jeff Beck. Okay, so that covers the Yardbirds, no doubt. Number 4, and many people are going to disagree with this, but that would have to be Jimi Hendrix. No Jimi Hendrix at number 1? Are you insane? No, I'm not insane, and that wasn't very nice. See what you've got me doing? You've got me answering my own question. At number 4, I'm aware that Jimi Hendrix totally reinvented guitar. Electric Ladyland would be one of my top 20 studio albums ever, and I continued to listen to his music, and I love it. But think about the 3 Yardbird guitar players at this point. Jeff Beck's still basically playing blues, although some of the riffs he pulls off with the Jeff Beck group amaze me. Clapton has experimented with a heavier sound, but he's already starting to regroup into a more pop-oriented style at this point. But it's Jimmy Page that in 1969, not only producing riffs that were every bit as original as anything Jimi Hendrix could come up with. But he invents a whole new genre of sound, a whole new genre of rock. Now, the very things that make me a Jimi Hendrix fan are the very same things that make me a Jimmy Page fan. Both of these guitarists, when playing live, took chances, and they took a lot of them. To me, Jimmy Page and Jimi Hendrix are the most bold guitar players in rock history. There would be new styles emerging. Other guitarists would branch out into other fields, Jeff Beck becoming a virtuoso in the field of pop, rock, jazz. And eventually, even Eric Clapton got back to his roots. But over the years, have you noticed? He's gotten a lot better. But Hendrix and Page took no prisoners, both guilty, as far as I'm concerned, of deliberately making mistakes just to see if they could get themselves out of it. And both generally quite successful at doing so. But I want to get back to the first Led Zeppelin album here. What was different about Led Zeppelin's first album that we didn't see on the Black Sabbath album and the rock album by Deep Purple a year later? Well, first of all, we see an establishment of a complete rock genre, a genre that both Black Sabbath and Deep Purple fit quite snugly into and would later be identified as belonging to. But it's on the Led Zeppelin album that we hear the germinations of sounds to come. It's on the Led Zeppelin album where we get the softer ballads. And though the ballads on this album sound a bit traditional, especially when you compare it to Led Zeppelin 3, Robert Plant is experimenting with his voice here, and he almost forces the more traditional pop, the more traditional blues to go in a whole different direction. Now, if there's anybody who's kind of been ignored in my previous two videos, it's probably Robert Plant. And the reason for that is, well, he's the front man. It's all too easy to cover Robert Plant first, and so I've held back a bit. But I have a confession to make. Robert Plant, despite what you know I feel about John Lennon and Paul McCartney as rock's premier vocalists at their time, Robert Plant is my favorite singer. I don't care what genre you're talking about. I'll compare him to Sinatra, even the greatest opera singers. No, I'm serious. In rock and roll, only Freddie Mercury comes close to Robert Plant. And yes, I know, there's lots of people out there that think Freddie Mercury is the superior singer. But long before Freddie Mercury even stepped on stage, Robert Plant does with his voice everything that I've talked about Jimmy Page doing with his guitar. Purposefully bending notes that don't exactly fit into the key he's singing and somehow rearranging it and making it fit. His range, my God, only McCartney and John Anderson, and of course later Geddy, could even begin to sing in his range successfully and in a way that people actually like to hear. And like I mentioned briefly in my last video, Robert Plant was kind of left with the job of supplying lyrics. And I think it came about with basically they were rewriting blues tunes and he was good enough to do that. But it wouldn't be too long before his songwriting was as mature as the Beatles themselves. And of course, remember, the Beatles went through their awkward stages. Hold Me Tight. Now, concerning these other two bands off to the side, their styles would change, especially after Led Zeppelin 3. But even in their next albums, they would start offering softer sides to the band. They saw the writing on the wall, and the hand that wrote it was Jimmy Page's. Now think about that first album. It supplied a couple of ballads, it had a brand new sound we hadn't heard. Why wouldn't they continue that for 4 or 5 albums in a row, just like most bands do today? But you see, that's why I love Led Zeppelin. They weren't a band put together to establish a sound and then just keep performing that sound from album to album. Jimmy Page never wanted that. Almost immediately, he's messing with Celtic tunings and more traditional English tunings. And then John Paul Jones saying, oh yeah, you know, I could do some stuff with that. And there's where the chemistry begins. Meanwhile, Robert Plant's in the corner writing Hobbit stuff, right? Also in my last video, I also brought up the fact that they weren't very preachy in their songs. In fact, I even brought up that most of the musings within their songs were from fictional characters set somewhere in Middle-earth. That's obvious, right? Once they did that, I reinterpreted everything from their earlier albums and even onward as everything happening somewhere in Middle-earth. Frodo couldn't be far away. They're more traditional heavy metal blues, and yes, they are the world's first heavy metal band, and they are the world's heaviest folk band. Now, I know there's a genre of heavy metal fans that say, oh no, Led Zeppelin's not heavy metal. And usually these people are focused on guitar shredders. A style, though impressive, didn't impress me as much as, say, Hendrix or Page in the 60s. But I can listen to Eddie Van Halen anytime. Now, in my last video, I also talked about what's wrong with modern bands today, touring so much that they have no time to write songs. Instead, at the end of the tour, they have weeks to put together a group of songs, and then they go in and they let producers finagle and change it and do whatever, and usually, especially sophomore albums, sound sophomoric. But not so with the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. Paul McCartney, John Lennon made time to write songs, and Jimmy Page and Robert Plant did so also. Now that's songwriters. You know, in today's music, I just have no use for people who are in bands who also write songs. I'm more focused on the songwriter first, and if they happen to be a virtuoso guitarist or one of the world's best utility players or the greatest drummer of all time, it's the songs that matter to me. Now, in my last video, I also brought up the problem with just eternal touring. Well, Led Zeppelin eternally toured, but they would stop their tours early, taking weeks prior to recording their next album just for writing new material. This band was a songwriting band first, and heavy metal folk gods later. Think of a handful of bands you really love. Then think, out of those bands, how many of them have bad songs or average songs? So that leads me back to my last video. There's a problem in modern day music, and that's why people are buying Beatle records and Led Zeppelin records, records from the Police, and records even from lesser bands from the 60s. Excellent bands, by the way, but lesser in stature. No, throughout their entire tenure, Led Zeppelin continued to search for new sounds, to improve their songwriting capabilities. Each and every band member getting better and better at playing through most of their career. Only when drugs or alcohol were involved did Led Zeppelin even appear to falter. Now, it's interesting here, the two bands that I've been comparing them with, and I only compare them to those two bands because they were the closest bands in popularity and the genre that Led Zeppelin was exploring. But think of those other two bands. No love lost between members, and yet Led Zeppelin, like the Beatles, always spoke about each other, even in hindsight, with love and tenderness. These men truly cared about one another. And like any tight-knit band of brothers, there were disagreements, of course. But like the Beatles, they never let the disagreements get in the way of the final product that they would share with the world. All right, as Forrest Gump would say, that's about all I have to say about that. All right, so we're going to continue on with our series on Led Zeppelin, no doubt. And of course, my next Beatles video, whenever I can get it out, that is, will be a comparison of Rubber Soul and Revolver. And the reason I'm going to do that is I started that whole series with the recording tricks that Geoff Emerick used while recording Revolver. And then I spent 5 videos on the Sgt. Pepper sessions. From there, we went to their very first album and have been following those albums in a linear fashion ever since. So in my last video, we covered Rubber Soul. But in my first video covering Revolver, I was so connected with what Geoff Emerick said in his book, I didn't cover everything that I wanted to. And besides, Rubber Soul and Revolver are my favorite Beatle albums, so indulge me one more time. Now, you may have noticed in my last video, another band's name came up. And I'm not even sure this will be the next band that I cover of Olympian status. But videos covering this band are definitely in the future, and that is the Police. In 6.5, 7 years, they recorded 5 albums, each getting better than the last, while they toured toured incessantly. So songwriting and touring can mix, if you're a true songwriter, that is. And I just want to mention another band that we'll be covering at this point, and that, of course, is a band that I connect with somehow with Led Zeppelin, and that is Jethro Tull. And no, that's not a guy. If you're looking for the guy, we're talking about Ian Anderson. You know, Ian Anderson was once quoted, "If we could take Jimmy Page's music and my lyrics, we could really do something special." Now, when he said that, he didn't mean that as a cut to Robert Plant, but evidently Robert Plant heard that and wasn't too happy. But Jethro Tull's not only one of my favorite bands of all time, but Ian Anderson is one of my very favorite songwriters of all time. Again, with all of these bands, songwriting, number one, instrumentation, number two, virtuosity, number three. And boy, do we get virtuosos in these bands. Okay, so that about covers my video for today, and I just want to thank everybody. But I cannot believe this, but we are at 230 subscribers. Your response to the videos have been amazing. Thank you so much, and really thank you for sharing those videos. If you weren't sharing those videos, our channel would be nowhere near 20,000, and we are now on our way to 24,000 views. Thank you. Okay, so this is also part of the video that I usually give my shout outs to, and they'll be running down here in front of me as I talk. Besides covering classic rock, besides covering the Beatles, I will also be giving commentaries on the shape of the recording industry. It is in horrible shape. Basically, nobody's buying albums unless it's 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, and the pop landscape, in my opinion, is full of people who can sing but couldn't write their way out of a paper bag. And all of that's coming in the future. This is the bottom line. I'm Michael Noland, and I'll see you in the next video.